Hey everybody, welcome into this edition of Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with CPA and personal financial specialist Phil Putney. I'm your co-host Mark Killian. Let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome into the show. We appreciate your time on the podcast as we talk investing, finance, and retirement with myself, Mark, as well as Phil. Grab your cup of coffee if you got one and listen to us chat or watch us talk about today's topic, which is going to be the truth about longevity risk. And Phil, what's up, buddy? How are you this week?
I'm doing great. Doing great.
Hanging in there?
Hanging in there.
I see the internet is messing with us a little bit. You're not as crisp as usual. You got to love work from home and Zoom. And all
yeah.
Things, right?
It's getting tested. Everything gets tested and changed. And I just was reading, about kind of the whole shopping side of things is totally getting restructured. I mean, it's,
I saw Dunkin' Donuts.
Time to make the donuts. Time to make the donuts.
Talking about closing 800 stores.
Yep.
Some of that was apparently on the books pre-COVID as well. Some of it not. So it made me think of two questions. A, are you a Dunkin' Donuts kind of person? And B, it's interesting because people see, well, the market's still, doing pretty good. I mean, it's still eking its way forward a little bit. It's
holding its own and kind of bouncing back and forth. Yeah.
But it feels weird when we see businesses closing and we talk about layoffs and we talk about eviction, things in the back and forth with the HEALS Act and whatever's going to happen there. So people have a bit of a disconnect understanding why it feels the economy is bad, but yet the market says it isn't. Part of it's forward thinking.
Yeah, that's always the case. Is the market always kind of builds in a lot of the bad news early on. Mm-hmm. I mean, we saw that definitely with this correction we went through. Right. Bounced back to a certain level, kind of where we're at now, and it has bounced, kind of waiting to see what the long-term effect is. And we're starting to see some of that, although I don't still think we've truly seen the whole effect of what we've gone through, and we're still not out of it yet either. So
should we take it as optimistic that the market sees it as if it's forward looking, that it's still continuing to kind of eke forward, that it feels positive on the future outlook, or is it maybe a false read?
No, I mean, I think it's built in, like we talked, some of the potential downfalls, although I mean, you do see that there have still been some pretty significant drops, so, I mean, it's still jittery. It's very nervous. So it doesn't take much bad news of something that it creates another down day or down week or whatever it happens to be. It usually happens towards the end of the month, it seems. So
and like always, it's one of those things where a down day might take an entire week to gain back. It's kind of like weight loss, right?
That's
well,
right.
In reverse, actually, I guess you can gain it like this, but
that cheat day and weight loss, and it takes you how long to get it back again?
Yeah, so, exactly.
Or get it off.
To get it off. There you go. Well, we'll jump in and hit our topic this week. Like I mentioned before, we're going to talk about the truth about longevity risk. My wife and I have been watching The Crown.
On days like today, ask yourself, in the time I've been on the throne, what have I actually achieved?
On Netflix about the Queen, and it kind of starts basically right around the time she took over for her father, and we were looking and we were kind of doing a little bit of Googling on some of the ancestors and so on and so forth, and you think back to like Edward the First. He actually lived to be 68 in the 1200s. That's pretty good.
That's a long life back then.
That's a long life in the 1200s, right? And I think I mentioned this on the podcast several weeks back. I read somewhere they're talking, 84, I think, for women, somewhere in that neighborhood now.
Yeah.
It's like 84, 78 for men, or 80 for men, something like that. And they're talking about, 95 for women, maybe 90, 92 for men in just as soon as 10, 12 years from now.
Yeah.
So it's 2020. We could be looking at 2040 at 100.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it with medical changes in technology and, I think a
3D printed lung, they'll do it.
Probably not too far off, and I think we're more health conscious, as a society today than what we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, so I mean, it kind of moves in cycles, but that's always the thing you've got to look at the plan is, and one of the dangers is looking at family history of, my parents only made it to their 60s. I don't think I'm going to make it, for another 5 years in retirement.
That's a small bit. I mean, right. Sure. Genetics play a part, especially, genetic, diseases. I have heart disease. I have coronary artery disease. All of my family has it on the one side. I've already had heart surgery in my 40s, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to pass away at 63 like my dad did.
Right. Technology is different today. The better treatment, there's but it's still something to take into account.
It is an account, right?
Right.
It's a piece of the pie. Like we talk about a lot of times, it's not the whole pie.
Right. You can't look at just, that was what they lived to, so that's what I'm planning to.
I mean,
it's always interesting to me when we get into that discussion with clients of what they're going to think, and I'm always encourage them to kind of, especially if they're thinking in that direction, to stretch that thought to say, well, what happens if,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What if you've inherited the long gene, so to speak, and
gene, I like that.
You make it to 85. What does that look like? Do you want to spend everything and then spend the last 10 years of your life living with the kids?
My mom stayed with us for a while, and that is not how you want to go. And she'll say the same thing, right? It's
right.
She was looking forward to being able to get into a senior apartment for her own independence. She's like, I love you guys, and I thank you for taking care of me and helping, but I need to get away from you just as much as you need to get away from me.
Right, and it's good for the relationship to have some separation.
And you're talking about technology leap forwards. Again, my dad had open heart in the 80s. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. I had it just 7 years ago, and I was in the hospital for 3 days.
Right.
Now, some of that might have been the insurance company saying, get out.
Get out, yeah.
But at the same time, the technology allows for that. So if you're thinking about longevity, and it's also something that in your industry, Phil, it's called a risk multiplier.
Yes, absolutely. Because, it does multiply all the other risks that you might have into the plan, because you've got to look at this money lasting instead of 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big differences in trying to compare to prior generations is kind of the components of income that they had. It was, back in those generations, more typical to have pensions,
right?
Guaranteed lifetime income,
right?
Heavily weighted in Social Security. So, there wasn't as much risk on your portfolio. That was kind of the extras. Where today, a lot of that has been shifted to you. You've now taken on more of that risk because pensions are pretty much a thing of the past. There's still
in the Michigan area, there's still a few.
Yeah, in our area, absolutely, with the auto companies. But those are even, I think the generation that we're starting to see retire now is going to be it. The pensions beyond that are just not there. Companies have realized that they can't do this anymore. They can't, insure a lifetime of income for somebody longer than what they actually work for the company for, which is a lot of times what happens.
Entirely possible, yeah. So if we're talking about longevity from that standpoint, oldest client, you don't have to name names, but what the oldest client you've had, maybe age-wise?
92.
Okay, all right. What about just a person you've known personally?
No one in our family has lived that age. My grandma lived to 88.
Okay.
So close.
Okay. So that client being 92 might have been the oldest person you knew as well?
Yep, it's probably personally.
Okay.
I've known of through clients, they've got people in their family that are nearing 100. I don't know that I know anyone personally or through kind of that first level that has made it to 100 yet. So,
okay, gotcha.
You hear about them in the news all the time.
But it happens all the time. We've got, I was just talking about the watching The Crown. They're both still alive, the Queen and her husband. And they are, I think he's 97, something like that. Yep. And she's like 94 or something like that. Who would have thought that, right? So, they're still cruising. Like Betty White.
People think, poor old Betty White, she doesn't know what she's saying. Oh, yes, you do.
So
yeah, exactly.
Our version of royalty, I think. So when you're talking about longevity, that breaks up a whole other interesting conversation with some people. There are definitely companies that are invested in prolonging the human experience. And so to your point earlier, if you can't have a pension that may last from a company that lasted longer than you actually worked there, and that's becoming more and more of a thing.
Right. Yeah. So you have to build those risks into your plan and really understand it. And with longevity, I think one of the most misunderstood or overlooked concept is your individual longevity. A lot of times, let's say it's the husband that maybe they have medical conditions and, they're thinking, well, for me, hey, I might not make it to 75. So I think, 10 or 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years, 150 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, 700 years, 800 years, 900 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, 700 years, 800 years, 900 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, 600 years, Social Security, this is the best option, or
sure.
my pension, I'm going to take, the 100% of it because I'm only going to be here this long and I want to enjoy it.
Right.
But what about a surviving spouse? And you really have to understand, for a married couple,
yep.
What's the probability that one of you is going to make it to a certain age? And that's really kind of the planning you have to look at. Is not individual life expectancies and longevity. It's more as a unit, what's the probability that one of you is going to make it to certain ages? And I mean, there's all sorts of studies. I was just looking at one of talking about, and the other point with longevity is at what age, right? So a lot of the statistics on longevity you think of, they're looking at from birth to X, so 84, right. You're living from birth to 84 for a female. Well, by the time you're 65, you already made it through the first 65 years. So now your longevity potential is even higher.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Now you've made it through those and the childhood perils and all the other things that could have happened to you. Now you're 65 going forward, so just taking that couple at 65, the probability of a male making it to age 85 is 43%, female is 55%. But the probability one of them is going to make it is 74.
Wow.
So it's one of those components you've got to really look at what's the chance that one of us is going to be there at that age, and plan accordingly. Because it is that multiplier.
That's a great point too. And you think about that, you have kind of gotten over the hurdle, so to speak. So, and I totally forgot that was out there. The closer you get to a certain age milestone, the better your chances of getting to the next one.
Right. Because you've made it past perils that have happened typically at those ages.
Yeah.
So
my mom's 79 and has, things that a 79-year-old would have, but it's all pretty minor. I mean, she's really quite fortunate. I tell her all the time, I mean, I've already had open heart surgery and a couple other major surgeries. I might kick the bucket before she does at the rate that she's going. So you never know, right? So that longevity factor. And if you're talking about that, and as we mentioned before, that you can kind of see that risk multiplier applying into that, folks, how effectively has the average person faced those challenges? How effectively have they looked at that challenge of saying, to your point just a minute ago, there's a good chance that you're going to hit 90, dear, whatever the case might be.
Mm-hmm. And it's not very often. I mean, usually I see it go one of two ways, right? Either they're looking at it and saying, well, I want to plan to 100. And I mean, there's some merit in that, but I guess the concern and the risk I have that way is just the opposite. What if you don't make it to that, and you've lived a very frugal life, didn't live the retirement you could have, passed away at normal life expectancies in the 80s or 90s. And now you've left a pile of money for the kids, which is great. Maybe that was your intention.
You didn't really get to kind of relive it up. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's one of those balancing acts where you've got to make sure you understand the risks on both sides.
Well, and that brings up an interesting point as well. So, let's say, both parties are doing well. We could go back to the Queen if we wanted to, right? They're both in their 90s now. But at some point, let's say in their 70s, one of them started to develop or late 70s or early 80s started to develop more of a debilitating disease. Now it becomes a huge financial drain. So when they do succumb to that and pass, the person who's moving on in their 90s, because you could really be drained if you're not careful.
Right. Yeah. And we talked about that in some of the other podcasts too, kind of the building the risk profiles and understanding the stress test on a plan. That long-term care component of it is huge. You've got to understand what that looks like and build for it. And that's one of maybe the downsides to longevity, right? We figured out how to make the physical body last longer but the mind, we haven't quite figured that one out yet. There's still dementia. And so we're starting to see higher levels of that because people are physically living longer.
That's true. And it can be a very costly illness, unfortunately, retirement.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you have that level of care is a lot higher level of care and cost than just you physically can't perform activities, so you need some assistance.
Right. In some cases, it could be as minor as a helper a couple of days a week. And then it could start to deteriorate into you can't be left alone.
Yeah. So longevity, again, is one of those pieces that I don't think enough thought is put into a plan typically. And it can change the whole picture. So you really have to understand and build that flexibility in. So.
Well, I tell you what, I think that's going to do it for this week as far as that. We're going to take an email question real quick before we go.
Sure.
So as always, folks, do us a favor, go subscribe to the podcast. If you've got questions about your own longevity plan, I should say, maybe not your own longevity, but your own plan, give Phil a call. Whether you want a second opinion or third opinion, or you haven't done anything yet, reach out to him, let him know at 248-888-7530. I'll put that on the screen for our viewers, 248-888-7530. And of course, you can go to philstaxhacks.com. That's philstaxhacks.com. Submit an email question to the show. Subscribe to us on whatever podcasting platform or YouTube you might like to use. And we'll see what we got from Trinity. And she is in Livonia. Beautiful name. Trinity says, Phil, which of my accounts should I withdraw from first when I retire? The 401k, the Roth IRA, my brokerage account that mainly consists of mutual funds, or just cash in the bank?
We work with a lot of clients in doing Roth conversions. So if we're trying to do conversions, we're going to be spending down like the brokerage account or cash in the bank first, because that doesn't generate a lot of taxable activity as we're doing that.
Okay.
So we can convert more of the IRAs into Roth. So I mean, if that's your plan, we're trying to control income better and reposition assets. Maybe it's spending those assets first, but then later on, you're probably going to be spending down some of the other assets. So it's, again, we talked in a prior podcast about building that financial house. What is the income need you have? This is that investment component. How have I designed the investments to provide that income? Which bucket is it coming from at which stage? So,
right. Okay.
So there's unfortunately no right or wrong answer or specific answer. It really comes back to what your plan.
Well, and so in this case, Trinity, if you're working with an advisor, ask them that question if you haven't already. Right. You're probably not, since you sent one into us, and we certainly thank you for listening to the podcast. Definitely call Phil and set up a time to have a conversation or whatever the case might be, or with someone so that you are taking the appropriate one. Because, right, as Phil mentioned, there can be tax ramifications. There's just so many little things that can be triggered, which is why we beat that drum, but that's why having a plan. That's why we do the show, because having a plan is super important, because, Phil's planned many retirement. You and I, Trinity, this would be our only one, for the most part. Most people only retire once. So make sure you reach out, get on the calendar, have a conversation. We're going to get out of here this week. So thank you for your time, folks, here on Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with Phil Putney, CPA and personal financial specialist at AFS Wealth Management. We'll see you next time.
Investment advisory services offered through AFS Wealth Management. The content of this program is provided for informational purposes only and is not a solicitation or recommendation of any investment strategy. Investments and/or investment strategies involve risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will achieve its objectives.